Hello guys, so a while ago I made a response to somebody called Laura Towler, sort of. The video was actually mostly on a comment that David Lammy made, but I found Towler's video in the process and decided to add a cheeky little response. And then basically a few days later I got loads of white nationalists commenting on that video and figured something must be up. So I went onto her Twitter and she tweeted the video, also citing it as the first response video she'd ever got. And then I didn't think about her for a while until today I went onto Twitter, and for some reason as I typed in Twitter to the search bar, I noticed that one of the autocomplete options was for her account. So I figured I'd check out her channel and see if there was another video worth responding to, and wouldn't you know it, there was a video called 30 Questions Globalists Can't Answer. This title is literally begging for a response video, so I present to you 30 questions globalists can't answer, answered, sort of. Some of them aren't answered that well, and some of them are actually asking questions about beliefs I don't hold to. Also, this whole thing is kind of a hollow exercise, seeing as Towler actually admits that many people will be able to answer these questions.
Now, you, the viewer of this video, might be able to answer all these questions, and if that's the case, then thank you, and I congratulate you for being consistent with your morals and your way of thinking.
So, I feel like I really took the wind out of this video's sails just then, but let's get started.
If we're all just the same, then how is diversity our strength?
So basically it's saying that we're all fundamentally the same when it comes to things like our worth and potential and how we should feel towards each other, but that there are loads of little differences between us that just help to spice things up. It's sort of like how in the Bible it says there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus in Galatians 3:28. But then it also says things like, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews in Galatians 2:14? And for it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman in Galatians 4:22, and but from the beginning of creation God made them male and female in Mark 10:6, annoyingly breaking my Galatians chain. But the point is, a difference which is said to not exist is repeatedly acknowledged, because when they say the difference doesn't exist, they are talking with reference to the applicability of the gospel, the love of God and the intrinsic human worth. But when they say the difference does exist, they are talking about the diversity of the heavenly kingdom. And obviously in the Bible, it repeatedly talks about all nations coming together. In fact, this Sunday just gone, the minister at my church was talking about how no church should just have people of one race in it. But I guess that's what I get for being a believer in Christianity.
If diversity is a strength, then how is it also a punishment for colonialism?
So the idea that diversity is your punishment for colonialism is not something I'm familiar with. I think it might be true to say that in some sense your racism is being punished by diversity, and it's sort of like in an ironic sense where it is your hatred of diversity that is being punished by diversity because for you it is a punishment. Like I've always thought a good cosmic punishment for racists would just be to have to live in the future where all races do get along and nobody gives a shit about their divisive racist ideas. I hate to get religious twice in a row, but it's sort of like this theological idea that heaven and hell are essentially the same experience, but from two different perspectives. For the believer, the presence of God is a warm and comforting glow, but for the unbeliever, the presence of God is a burning and agonizing fire. And in this context, obviously, diversity is the presence of God, and for the non-racist, diversity is a pretty nice thing. You get to experience a rich tapestry of cultures right outside of your front door. But for the racist, diversity is a horrible thing because they have to be near brown people. So diversity is not a punishment for colonialism, it's a punishment for racism.
If immigration is our punishment for colonialism, then are you saying that the presence of immigrants here is bad?
Since this is the same question twice, I decided to just space out my answers a bit and also point out that clearly the primary purpose of diversity and immigration is not just to piss off racists. That's just an added benefit. The idea that immigration is supposed to serve some kind of punitive role seems like something only a white nationalist could believe.
Why is multiculturalism a good thing when it's imposed on white people and a bad thing when it's imposed on other indigenous peoples?
I'm not really sure what this is in reference to, but immediately I think of the North Sentinelese who violently chase off any contact with the outside world. Except, that isn't a good thing. The fact that these people are living shitty, backwards, reclusive lives is bad, and I'd much rather they entered the international community. And this is the same for all uncontacted tribes. The big problem with diversity in these cases is that we probably carry diseases that these people are not exposed to, but that kind of represents the problem. These uncontacted and isolated tribes are weak because they have no experience with the world beyond their small society. This leaves them very vulnerable. Meanwhile, because the rest of the world is interconnected, we are in a much better off situation. But apart from that, For most of the world, I'm totally down with diversity. More white people in India, more Arabs in China, more Thais in Africa, etc., etc. I don't know many people who believe that kind of diversity is a bad thing. Now, maybe you know somebody from one of these areas who said that they don't want other ethnicities living in their homeland. Well, in that case, congratulations. You just spoke to a racist.
Why is white pride condemned, but pride of any other ethnic group is celebrated?
Because white people are not marginalised in most countries where white pride is a thing. Black pride relates to standing strong despite historic and ongoing oppression. Since there is very little historic and ongoing oppression for white people, a pride parade would be inappropriate. Come on, you know this. It's the same reason why a straight pride parade would be frowned upon.
If there's no such thing as race, then how is there such a thing as white privilege?
There is a famous adage in progressive racial politics: race is real in that its effects are real. This basically explains it. Because I generally meet most people's classifications of white, I get certain privileges which don't exist for people who are classified as black.
If race is just a social construct, then how do they know that we've always been a nation of immigrants because we dug up black skeletons during the Roman occupation of Britain?
Because those skeletons fit our socially constructed idea of race. That's like saying, if species are a scientific construct, then how do we know that we dug up a Tyrannosaurus Rex? Constructs exist to categorize the world around us, and race exists to categorize certain people into different groups based on how they look. Since certain skeletons cohere with the characterization of black people, we can say that such people were black. We could also say that applying the label of black to these people might have been misleading precisely because black is a contemporary social construct. This is one reason why many Egyptologists aren't fond of huge debates over whether Egyptians were black or white, because black and white are contemporary social constructs that don't really matter to ancient Near Eastern societies. However, the reason people say that early Europeans were black, or some of them were black, is to counteract other people who apply contemporary ideas of whiteness to European prehistory to show how wrong those people are.
If there's no such thing as British culture, then how is Ramadan now part of British culture?
I've never heard either of these claims being made before. I've never heard somebody say that British culture doesn't exist, or that Ramadan is part of British culture. I suspect any remarks about British culture not existing are most likely a joke, mostly grounded in the fact that British culture is so dominant that it often seems like no culture at all, since it's sort of just the default. That's my guess. People sort of make similar jokes about the US, like how the difference between a yogurt and the USA is that if you left a yogurt for 200 years, it would develop some culture. But obviously the USA does have a distinct culture. As for Ramadan being a part of British culture, I mean, I guess, but I've not heard of that. So since the question doesn't really apply to me, I'm just going to point out that undeniably, a lot of British culture comes from non-white people. Most obvious would be something like grime music, which is very distinctly British and pioneered largely by black people. And then in terms of food, you have a lot of curries which were invented in Britain, and our British national dishes up there with fry-ups, roast dinner and fish and chips. Also, I feel that the British fondness for kebab vans has possibly elevated kebabs up to an institution of British culture. So this is kind of answering a different question at this point, but yes, British culture does exist, and yes, a significant part of British culture has been contributed to by non-white people.
If America belongs to the American Indians because they were there first, does Britain belong to the Britons because we were here first?
I don't think there are that many lunatics out there who want to repatriate all non-natives from America and have that land become an American Indian ethno-state. Ireland is pretty empty, so maybe all the Irish Americans could head on over to there, although I suspect the Irish wouldn't appreciate that. Actually, that's a good point. Would Towler like it if all the non-white people were kicked out of Europe, but then all the Americans and Australians came back, roughly according to where the majority of their heritage is? Spain and Portugal would be fucked. Anyway, on a more sincere note, there are those who stress the importance of Native American rights and Native American representation, but again, that's because of the shitty situations the Native Americans find themselves in, where they are basically some of the worst off communities in North America, with drugs and sexual assault and poverty all being massive problems for them. In that situation, some degree of nationalism becomes justified. But firstly, British people are not in a situation comparable to American Indians, and also, secondly, nobody is saying that North America should become an Indian ethno-state, and that all non-natives should be repatriated, which seems to be what a lot of nationalists want for Britain.
Why are white Americans told to go back to Europe where they came from because America belongs to the American Indians, while Europeans are told that we all came from Africa so our nations aren't ours?
White Americans are almost exclusively told to go back where they came from when they make racist claims about other races by characterizing them as invaders. If they say that black people don't belong in the USA, or that Latinos don't belong in the US, or act horrendously to Native Americans, then people will point out to them that they are not native to the US, and therefore by their own logic they should go back where they came from. What you're doing here is confusing people pointing out hypocrisy with people actually being hypocritical. Non-racists believe that all races should be free to live in America, but some white American racists believe that white Americans should be the only inhabitants or should have a privileged position in America, and that is when people say that they are being hypocritical. As for Europeans being told that we come from Africa, I'm guessing you're talking about the fact that all nations have some immigrants, but you don't need to go back to Africa to show that most European nations are made up of immigrants. There have been many mass migrations to the British Isles in recorded history.
If Africans are allowed to live in Britain because of the British Empire, does this mean that anybody can go live in any country that they've previously been invaded by? Or could it just be that a falsified narrative of the British Empire is used to guilt white people into opening up their borders and is manipulated by people who want to live in a first world civilization so that they don't have to create their own?
Holy shit, that question was leading. So regarding the first part, I mean, sort of. In principle, anybody should be able to live anywhere. In practice, there are some reasonable limitations that should be placed on immigration to take into account some economic and cultural factors. In general, the more connected cultures are, the more sense it makes that there would be a lot of immigration between them. That's why having been part of the British Empire causes many Africans to move to Britain, because that just makes more sense than them moving to most other places. And in general, yes, it seems like being invaded does establish the basis for immigration. Like America invaded Southeast Asia, and there are loads of Southeast Asians in America. France invaded North Africa, and there are loads of North Africans in France. There are a lot of factors that affect immigration, but one of those factors will be the lasting impact of an enduring occupation. But it isn't having been invaded or occupied that justifies immigration, since immigration doesn't need a justification.
If we were so oppressive and awful to your ancestors, then why did you want to come and live with us?
Most ethnic minorities who are angry with white people tend to be second-generation immigrants, in my experience, or immigrants who moved over there when they were young, so they didn't choose to live in the West. But also, maybe because you can be annoyed at some aspects of a society and like other aspects, and perhaps even want to improve the society you live in rather than just leave.
If you demand reparations for slavery, then how much are you going to demand from the black slavers who sold your ancestors to us?
We're talking about long-term profit here. White people profited from slavery in the long term. This is pretty undeniable. We extracted a lot of surplus value. By contrast, the black slavers actually lost a lot of their population through the slave trade. And when the slave trade ended, many African societies collapsed, which directly led to the scramble for Africa. So far from profiting from slavery, the West African societies ultimately became totally bankrupt from it. Therefore, there are no reparations to be made. However, European societies more often did profit from slavery, and that profit has had a lasting impact on those economies for the better, hence reparations. It's like if you found out somebody stole a priceless diamond that belonged to your family. If that person sold that diamond, started a business, was really successful, and you find out that their children are now millionaires who are shareholders in a massive business, you might feel that an injustice was done to you, since the valuable diamond was stolen from your family, and that provided the initial funds to the success. Therefore, the wealth of that family is because of an injustice done to you and your family, so you want some of that wealth for yourself. However, if you find out that the person who stole that diamond sold it for much less than it was worth and used that money to buy crack and now their ancestors live in squalor, you can be angry, but you can't justifiably demand reparations.
If you're so concerned about slavery, then where's your concern for the 40 million plus people who are slaves today? Or do they not matter because they're not held captive by white people?
Most people are primarily concerned about the societies they live in and the problems with those societies.
If you care about the well-being of people from other nations, then why are you happy to take their best doctors, scientists and engineers?
Okay, so I actually agree with Towler here, and this is something I've believed for a long time. I remember I was reading an article about how in Malaysia there was this huge push to get people into higher education, and the government invested loads of money and effort into it, and all the high-skilled people then migrated, especially people in the medicine fields. And this was a disaster for Malaysia. And now they've scaled this back, which sucks because that's what we want countries to do. We want countries to invest in their own infrastructure and citizens, and that should be incentivized. This is why I've always believed that immigration should mostly be low-skilled workers, because we in the UK have some of the best universities in the world. We are one of the richest countries in the world. We should be able to give every citizen of this country a really top quality education free of charge, and if we are lacking skilled workers, then the government has seriously failed. Most citizens born in the UK should be educated and should be doing good jobs because they should be getting a top quality education that a country as rich as the UK should be able to provide. And then for the low skilled workers, we should bring in immigrants from countries that are poorer where the education isn't as good. And they can either work here temporarily and then return back or stay here. And of course, if they can have children, then their children could get the same first rate education that all children born in the UK should get. Now, in practice, the government fucks up so much that it's almost not worth talking about these ideas. The government doesn't provide the fantastic education it should be able to, so the whole thing kind of falls apart. But I do agree that we shouldn't be poaching the most skilled people from developing countries. We should be able to get more than enough skilled people from the population we already have.
If we needed immigrants to rebuild Britain after World War II, then why didn't we need immigrants after World War I when more than double the amount of people died? If it's because Britain was damaged after the Blitz, then why didn't Japan need immigrants after Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
This seems to be missing the part where Britain was really underpowered in the interwar years. Like, that's the whole reason we were so reluctant to go to war with Germany, because we weren't really ready. And as for Japan, well, apart from anything else, one of the reasons why the bombing of Japan was so devastating is because Japan had a history of building their houses out of cheap, flimsy material. And while this means it got destroyed really easily, it also means Japan didn't have that much value tied up in their infrastructure. But also, I don't think anybody is saying that we couldn't have recovered without bringing in immigrants. People are simply saying that undeniably bringing in more people would have sped up the process, unless you're going to argue that all the immigrants from the empire went straight onto benefits or something.
If we needed immigrants to rebuild Britain after World War II, then why did our government fund the £10 POM scheme which encouraged 1.5 million Britons to move to Australia?
So this is the question I'm least fit to answer, and I don't know that much about this scheme. What I did pick up from a quick Google is that it was Australia who really seemed to want this. Like, the idea was that Australia was seriously underpopulated and really needed more people to move in. So it's not as if Britain was just throwing away able-bodied men because they had them to spare. Both areas were not as populated as they could be, and it was seen that population was a good thing. So there was plenty of immigration from the empire, and also there was some emigration to underpopulated parts of the empire. Pretty simple, seemingly.
If David Lammy is as British as us, then shouldn't he apologise for slavery and colonialism too?
Nobody thinks you should apologise for slavery and colonialism, or nobody who matters at least, because you didn't engage in slavery and colonialism. You should acknowledge that you have the privilege of being born into a country that has profited from the exploitation of other countries and peoples. You might have mistaken people telling you this with people telling you that you are responsible for slavery and colonialism. So no, Lammy doesn't need to apologise for slavery and colonialism, but then neither do you. The only sense in which anybody might need to apologise for slavery and colonialism is that the leader of the UK, as a representative of the country, might occasionally acknowledge as a diplomatic representative of the UK that the UK has not been the best they can be to many other countries. That is a far cry from any living individual personally apologising for anything that was done by other people long before they were born.
If Afua Hirsch is as British as us, then why did she write in her book Brit-ish that she left Britain to leave being British?
I don't know who Afua Hirsch is, but she seems to be black, so I'm guessing you're saying that us globalists would say she's British, but she herself has denied the label of British. But the thing is, if anybody denies the label of British, then at some point I would accept that they aren't British. So in general, I would say any black person born in the UK is just as British as any white person born in the UK. However, if a black person insists that they are not British and refuses to go by that label, I wouldn't insist that they are, contrary to their explicit claims. Similarly, however, if a Scottish person insisted they were not British as they considered themselves Scottish and they wanted independence and hated Britain, then I would also accept that they aren't British. It doesn't therefore follow that Scottish people shouldn't be considered British as the default.
Why do the British only exist when you're blaming us for colonialism?
But your last question was all about how globalists do think British people exist, since you're saying that globalists consider Afua Hirsch to be a British citizen. You can't really have 30 questions that globalists can't answer, and have 2 of these questions start with contradictory premises.
Why can't we feel proud of our ancestors, but we can feel guilty for colonialism?
Right, we've been through this before. British people aren't blamed for colonialism. The role of colonialism in laying the foundations for Britain's wealth relative to many of the countries they colonised is acknowledged, and therefore you're not being blamed for colonialism, you're being blamed for revelling in the enduring profits of colonialism while proclaiming pride in the people who originally extorted their wealth.
Why can't I feel proud of my ancestors, but you can feel victimised because of yours?
Because many non-white people still live with the disadvantages inherited from years of racism and poverty. So much of that victimized status has been inherited. By contrast, you can't inherit pride. Like, if my dad was a slave all his life and never got an education, and therefore I was raised in the ghetto, and things are much harder for me because of that, then I can claim that my heritage is part of the reason that my life is shit. So I can feel like a victim because of the situation I've inherited. By contrast, whatever your ancestors did, no matter how impressive, it will never be something you did. So you can't ever feel proud of what they did.
If Britons are collectively guilty for colonialism, then are Muslims collectively guilty for the Islamic invasions of Europe?
Privilege. It's not about guilt, it's about privilege. The reason why colonialism is still a sore spot is because the effects of colonialism are still felt. British people are still richer because of colonialism, and the people in the countries that we robbed from are generally still poorer. This is not true with regards to Islamic exploits in Europe, and indeed, we have since in many cases actually gone on to invade these Islamic lands ourselves. And yes, if over the next hundreds of years things change, countries get invaded, empires collapse and fall, new countries get created, then chances are at the end of that, things will have shifted so much geopolitically that colonialism will no longer be geopolitically relevant, and then you can live without people being mean to you for being white. Again, this isn't about inherited guilt, it's about inherited wealth and advantages. If those inherited privileges are gone, then concerns over colonialism go with it.
Why are all nationalists held responsible for the acts of some nationalists, but all Muslims aren't held responsible for terrorist attacks committed by Muslims?
Because nationalism is intrinsically shitty. I mean, the more violent acts committed by nationalists are bad, but it's not as if non-violent nationalism isn't bad. By contrast, most Muslims don't believe anything shitty, at least not explicitly. Yes, if you read the Quran that they claim to believe, you'll find that they believe a whole load of shitty things implicitly, but that's different from nationalists who wear the shitty things that they believe as a badge of honour.
Why do people say, well, if we weren't bombing their countries after a Muslim commits a terror attack, but they don't say, well, if they weren't invading our continents after a white person attacks a Muslim?
Mrs. Towler, take a second to think about what you just said. Western countries go into Muslim countries and kill people with very little justification, and they have been doing so for the last century. Going right back to when the British government funded radical Muslim clerics to provoke rebellion against the government in Afghanistan that was on the verge of giving women the vote in 1919, all the way up to today when Western countries have deposed governments in Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya, all to disastrous effects, and meanwhile, the government of Yemen is being propped up by the West, who are standing by as Saudi Arabia commits war crimes to protect their interests. And you can really pick any time over the last 100 years and find the West doing really shitty stuff to Islamic countries. And every single time the West does this stuff, Muslims die in the thousands, while the West gets richer, because that is the whole purpose of these wars, to benefit wealthy Western interests and transfer wealth from Arab countries to Western countries. And you also have serious human rights abuses, like those in Abu Ghraib prison and Guantanamo Bay. And your question is, why is it that when Muslims commit terrorist attacks, people might point to the actions of the West in Muslim countries as a significant part of the explanation, but when a random hate crime is committed against a Muslim, you don't understand why the fact that Muslims are moving to the West isn't considered justification at all. To me, the way you ask this question so sincerely shows just how warped your worldview is. That in your mind, minorities simply existing in Europe is in some way equivalent to violent expansionist wars being fought by an invading power at the cost of hundreds of thousands of civilian lives.
Why should we only carry on as normal and not look back in anger after an Islamic terror attack?
I don't even know what this means. I mean, the most recent non-Islamic terrorist attack that springs to mind was the New Zealand attack, and people have generally moved on from that, seemingly. In general, terrorist attacks don't have a massive effect on the world when you really look at things in perspective. Indeed, the major terrorist attack that did have a lasting effect on the world was the September 11th attack, and that was committed by Muslim terrorists.
Why are the people who claim to care the most about the environment also the people who want the most immigration, which increases our population and has a negative impact on the environment?
Because people who care about the environment want to ensure that we care for our population sustainably. If our government decided to make environmental sustainability a priority, then we could be environmentally sustainable with or without immigrants. Likewise, if our government is going to do very little and not take drastic measures to help the environment, then we will fail to be environmentally sustainable with or without immigrants. Even if we accept that immigration might be worse for the environment on balance, we're well past the point of better or worse being a meaningful consideration. Either we're making the most sincere effort to be environmentally sustainable possible, or we're not. The small benefit from limited migration isn't really relevant.
How can you call yourself a feminist when you ignore violence towards women with different ideologies, teenage girls in Rotherham and 8-year-old girls at pop concerts?
Right, okay, here's the thing. A feminist isn't just somebody who is against bad things happening to women. If a bank robber walks into a bank and ends up shooting the female bank clerk, that's not a feminist concern. That's a concern about violent crime. It doesn't seem likely that the bank clerk was shot because she was a woman. So feminism can't just be reduced down to, oh, a bad thing happened to a woman. Feminists assemble. This is most obvious when you talk about girls being blown up at pop concerts. That was a terrorist attack committed against the West by some guy who hated the West. It wasn't a feminist issue. If the guy who committed the bombing was an incel, for example, that would be a feminist issue. Regarding violence against women with different ideologies, sometimes that can be a feminist issue. For example, attacking women who reject trans identity politics is a feminist issue. In fact, attacking women because they're feminist is most definitely a feminist issue. I'm guessing that you're talking about women being attacked because they're white nationalists or identitarians, whatever word you like to use. Now, that isn't really a feminist issue, since men probably are just as likely, if not slightly more likely, to be attacked for holding to your views. I think the only case in which it might be a feminist issue is if the harassment of women is explicitly sexual and misogynistic in nature, and in that case I'd agree, that is a problem regardless of your ideology. This video is already long, so I'm not going to get into whether or not alt-right people should be attacked for their ideology, but they should, obviously. The best shout for an actual feminist issue would be the sex trafficking in Rotherham, although, to my knowledge, the problem has been solved and the scandal is over. Now, there are still sex gangs around, and that should be an enduring concern, and I'll even grant that maybe some feminists aren't as concerned about this as they should be because they don't want to seem racist against Pakistanis, but still, most feminists are concerned about it. As far as I know, there are no high-profile cases about existing sex gangs right now, so that probably explains why not much is being said about it.
Why is it open borders for Europe, but not open borders for Israel?
I really don't know who this question is directed at, because most people I know who support open borders are very anti-Zionist and opposed to Israel as a Jewish ethno-state, and most people I know who are pro-Zionist and pro-Israel being an ethno-state are very anti-immigration to the West. I think the closest you could get to the position you're arguing against would be somebody who is taking into account the geopolitical and historical context. It does make sense, given the historical record, that Jewish people would be more opposed to becoming a minority than white people would, because of that thing which you may or may not believe actually happened. And even talking about contemporary geopolitics, the neighbours of the Jews literally hate them. In that context, I think pure open borders could present a problem. If your neighbours are itching to invade you and it's only a firm military position that's keeping them at bay, then open borders would be a bad idea. But that's not the situation most white countries are in. And by the way, I don't support pure open borders for white countries either. Pure open borders with the Democratic Republic of the Congo would not be a good idea. Nor would pure open borders with Afghanistan. 100% open borders, anybody can live anywhere, no questions asked, is an end goal that will hopefully be achieved when societies start to become more interconnected and any current international tensions begin to calm down. Now, in Europe right now, we are much closer to that goal than they are in the Middle East. I'm sure you would be willing to admit this. So there's your answer to why it might be open borders for white countries and not for Israel. Although again, that's with the caveat that most people aren't advocating 100% open borders for white countries or 100% closed borders for Israel. And there are plenty of people on the left who seem to be worryingly keen to just let Israel cease to exist. So I don't see how you can suggest there is much hypocrisy surrounding the Jews on this issue.
Why are the group who claim to be the most oppressed also the group with the power to silence you?
This is a really classic one. I've wanted to make a video on free speech for a while now. Basically, it used to be that the power of the state was wielded to help those at the top and subjugate those at the bottom. So generally speaking, you could reliably say that the actions taken by the state would always serve to benefit most powerful and the best off. But then something changed. The underclass began to rise up, and suddenly things like taxation, which had previously gone towards the lavish lifestyles of those in power, now went to public services that primarily benefited those worse off, and things started to even up in terms of social justice issues, with women getting the vote and minorities getting fair representation. And then eventually, following this trend, the power of the state began to protect those who were worst off. Just as the power of the state to collect revenue went from benefiting the richest to benefiting the poorest, so too did the power of the state to curb certain behaviour go from helping the most powerful to helping the least powerful. And that is why today, in liberal democracies, you can say pretty much anything you want about how awful the government is, and how awful the established church is, and how awful the rich are, because it used to be saying those things could get you arrested and maybe even tortured or killed. But we have advanced from that. But the most powerful still have some power, even if not based on the state. They have the power to influence, and the power to do real harm to people, especially those people who have the least power. So if you today start saying horrible shit about black people or Jews or Hindus or whatever else, you're going to get ostracized and possibly even arrested for hate speech. But if you look at the direction that our society's been going in, which is one of power ceasing to benefit the most powerful and beginning to benefit the least powerful, then that's precisely why the most oppressed groups are the ones with the most power to silence you. Although, the most oppressed groups don't themselves have the power to silence you. They are reliant on the government that rules over them, caring enough about them to actually stop hate speech and racist rhetoric or whatever else. Problem is, you're still looking at the power of the state as if the Protestant Reformation and the French Revolution are yet to come, which I imagine is convenient because you probably wish those things had never happened. So therefore, you just look at whose state power seems to most obviously benefit and assume that those must be the most powerful people. We've kind of been moving away from that for the last 200 years. Slowly but surely. So that was a long video, but hopefully we all learned something. But I don't feel like doing much of a long outro. Like and comment, subscribe and share, follow me on Twitter, and give on Patreon. And on the off chance that you are in fact Laura Towler, hello, feel free to acknowledge this or not, and thank you for watching to the end. Thank you to my current patrons: Hannah Taylor, LRX89, Stephen, Kirsten, Nancy Diamond, Stephen Lester, Rosemary Furman, and Eric Hernandez. You're all very appreciated.
Do it! Just do it! Yes, you can!